The early morning fog that settled over the pine forests of East Texas in April 1983 created a particular silence, the kind that seemed to amplify rather than muffle sounds. Park Ranger Thomas Wilkins, name altered, had been making his routine patrol through the Sam Houston National Forest when the radio in his Ford Bronco crackled. The dispatcher's voice, usually steady, carried an unmistakable tension. A Boy Scout troop camping in the northern section had reported a child missing. Protocol dictated immediate action, but something in the dispatcher's tone suggested this was not a simple case of a boy wandering off to explore. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the dense pine canopy when Wilkins arrived at the campsite. Several county sheriff's deputies were already there, their cruisers parked in a semicircle, emergency lights cutting silently through the mist. The scout leader, a math teacher from Conroe named Alan Harris, name altered, stood with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, speaking in hushed tones to a deputy. The remaining scouts, boys aged 12 to 14, had been gathered around a now extinguished campfire, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and fear. Wilkins approached the officer in charge, Deputy Sheriff Ray Hansen, who had been with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department since 1977. The two men knew each other from previous search and rescue operations. "What's the situation?" Wilkins asked, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Hansen glanced at his notepad. 12-year-old went missing sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. Scout leader did bed checks at midnight, everyone accounted for. At 5 a.m., one of the boys woke up and noticed his tent mate was gone, sleeping bag empty, boots gone. No signs of struggle in the tent. What neither man knew at that moment was that this disappearance would become the first documented case in a pattern that would haunt East Texas for the next 3 years. A pattern that would eventually be traced back to earlier, seemingly unconnected incidents across 3 counties. A pattern that would reveal a methodical predator whose ritualistic behavior had gone undetected due to jurisdictional boundaries and the limitations of pre-digital law enforcement. The 1980s marked a transitional period in American criminal investigation. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, formally established only a few years earlier, was still developing its protocols for serial offender profiling. VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, designed to connect seemingly unrelated violent crimes, wouldn't become operational until 1985. Computer databases were primitive by modern standards, and cross-jurisdictional communication relied heavily on personal relationships between departments rather than standardized information-sharing systems. These limitations created environments where methodical offenders could operate undetected for years, particularly in rural or semi-rural areas where law enforcement resources were stretched thin. East Texas, with its patchwork of national forests, state parks, small towns, and isolated rural communities, provided such an environment. By mid-morning, the search party for the missing scout had grown to include volunteers from neighboring communities. 4 additional sheriff's deputies had arrived, along with a K-9 unit from Huntsville. The dog, a German shepherd named Rex, was given the boy's sleeping bag to smell. The animal led its handler toward the northwest edge of the campsite, into the dense forest, but lost the scent after approximately half a mile. What the search party found instead was disturbing enough to immediately escalate the missing person case to a potential abduction. Hanging from a pine branch about 7 feet off the ground was a Boy Scout merit badge, swimming, with its distinctive wave pattern. The badge was suspended by what appeared to be fishing line, turning slightly in the breeze. Deputy Hansen ordered everyone to step back, recognizing it as potential evidence. The badge belonged to the missing boy, confirmed by the scout leader, who explained that each scout kept their earned badges in small plastic containers in their backpacks until they could be sewn onto their sashes. The discovery transformed the atmosphere of the search. Deputies who had been calling the boy's name through cupped hands now spoke in hushed tones, radios were turned down, and hands moved to rest on holstered service weapons. The search continued throughout the day, extending outward from the location of the suspended badge. At approximately 4:30 p.m., another badge was discovered, this one for first aid, hanging from a different tree nearly a mile from the first. The systematic search pattern had to be expanded, requiring additional personnel as daylight began to wane. As night fell, portable lights were brought in, powered by generators whose low rumble formed a constant background to the search efforts. Parents of the missing boy had arrived from their home in the Woodlands, a planned community north of Houston that had been developed in the early 1970s. They waited at the ranger station, where a chaplain from the sheriff's department stayed with them. The first night passed without further discoveries. By the following morning, the FBI had been notified and was sending agents from the Houston field office. Local news stations from Houston had dispatched crews, and a command center was established at the ranger station. It was during the second day of searching that the pattern began to reveal itself to investigators. A third merit badge, camping, was found hanging from a tree another mile from the second. The badges were forming a northwesterly line that led deeper into the national forest, away from roads and established trails. What happened next would haunt the investigators for years to come. Following the line established by the three badges, search teams discovered an abandoned hunting cabin approximately 4 miles from the original campsite. The structure, a simple one-room building with boarded windows, had not appeared on any Forest Service maps and was believed to have been built illegally on federal land decades earlier. Inside the cabin, they found the missing boy's backpack and jacket, neatly placed on a crude wooden table. There was no sign of the child. The cabin showed signs of recent habitation: a Coleman lantern, a cooler containing unopened canned food, and a sleeping bag that didn't match the one the boy had been using. Forensic technicians from Montgomery County, working with newly arrived FBI agents, began processing the cabin for evidence. Fingerprints were collected from surfaces, fibers vacuumed, and the surrounding area searched for footprints or tire tracks. Approximately 200 yards behind the cabin, investigators found a narrow dirt road that couldn't be seen from the hunting cabin itself. Tire impressions indicated a vehicle had been parked there recently, the tread pattern suggesting a light truck or van with all-terrain tires. The impressions were photographed, and casting material was used to create molds. Despite an extensive search that eventually involved over 200 people, including volunteers from as far away as Dallas, the missing scout was not found. As days turned to weeks, the active search was gradually scaled back, though the investigation remained open and active. 2 months later, in June 1983, another Boy Scout troop camping in Davy Crockett National Forest, approximately 70 miles north of the first incident, reported a similar disappearance. A 13-year-old scout vanished overnight from a campsite. In this case, search parties almost immediately found a merit badge, archery, hanging from a pine tree less than a quarter mile from the campsite. The similarity to the April disappearance prompted immediate communication between the two county sheriff's departments involved. FBI agents who had been assigned to the first case now shifted their attention to this new incident, immediately recognizing the pattern. This time, the search was conducted with the knowledge gained from the previous disappearance. Teams followed a methodical grid pattern extending outward from the location of the suspended badge, while also sending teams in the direction the badges had led in the previous case. Sure enough, a second badge, Wilderness Survival, was found approximately a mile from the first, again hanging from a tree branch at about 7 feet from the ground. A third badge, Orienteering, was located another mile further. The search teams, now accompanied by tactical units from both county sheriff's departments, followed the line established by the badges. Approximately 3 miles from the campsite, they discovered not a cabin this time, but a 1978 GMC Vandura, with windows covered from the inside with dark material. The van was empty when discovered, but a search of the surrounding area revealed a shallow pit that had been recently dug and then filled in again. Excavation of the site revealed the remains of the first missing scout. The discovery confirmed investigators' worst fears, while simultaneously providing the first substantial evidence in the case. The remains were transported to the Harris County Medical Examiner's office in Houston, where forensic pathologists worked to determine the cause of death, while evidence technicians processed every inch of the van. The second missing scout was never found, despite weeks of searching. The pattern, however, was now clear to investigators. They were dealing with an offender who specifically targeted Boy Scouts, took them to remote locations, and left a trail of the victim's own merit badges as either a taunt to law enforcement or as part of some personal ritual. The GMC Vandura provided crucial evidence. Fibers matching both victims' clothing were found inside. The vehicle had been stolen from a used car lot in Tyler, Texas, 4 months earlier. Its license plates had been stolen from another vehicle in Dallas. The interior had been modified with additional locks on the rear and side doors, locks that could only be operated from the driver's area. Despite this evidence, investigators had no suspect. No fingerprints were found inside the van other than those belonging to the original owner and employees of the car lot. The only unusual item discovered was a partial map of Sam Houston National Forest with several locations marked in red ink, all Boy Scout camping areas. As news of the discoveries spread, parents across East Texas began withdrawing their children from scouting activities. Summer camps saw record cancellations. Scout troops that continued to meet did so indoors, in churches and school gymnasiums rather than forests and parks. Law enforcement agencies across the region established a task force dedicated to the case. The FBI assigned additional agents and resources. Patrol officers increased their presence around schools and in areas where youth groups gathered. A telephone hotline was established for tips and potential sightings. For 11 months, there were no further incidents matching the pattern. Some investigators speculated that the offender had moved to another region or had been arrested for an unrelated offense. Others believed the increased police presence and public awareness had caused him to suspend his activities temporarily. Then, in May 1984, a scout disappeared from a campsite in Angelina National Forest, creating a triangle with the previous two incidents. The now familiar pattern of suspended merit badges was discovered, leading searchers to a pickup truck parked on a logging road and nearby a freshly disturbed area of ground that contained partial remains of the second victim from the previous year. This third incident provided additional evidence but still no clear suspect. The pickup truck, like the van before it, had been stolen, this time from a shopping mall parking lot in Beaumont. Again, the interior had been modified with additional security features, and again, no usable fingerprints or other identifying evidence was found. What investigators did discover was a receipt for gasoline purchased at a service station in Lufkin, dated the day before the disappearance. The service station, like many in the early 1980s, did not have security cameras. The attendant, when interviewed, had no specific recollection of the vehicle or driver, having served dozens of customers that day. The third victim was never found, despite extensive searches. The pattern was now unmistakable, and the fear palpable across East Texas. Boy Scout activities in the region were officially suspended by the organization's leadership. Schools implemented additional security measures for all outdoor activities. Parents began accompanying their children to and from school and extracurricular activities. The task force expanded to include officers from 12 counties and 3 different federal agencies. Behavioral analysts from the FBI developed a profile of the offender, likely a white male aged 30 to 45, with above-average intelligence and outdoor skills. Probably employed in a job requiring mechanical aptitude. Likely had a history of interest in youth organizations without necessarily having a criminal record. Possibly had experienced rejection from such organizations in his own past. The profile was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout Texas and neighboring states. Local newspapers and television stations ran stories asking the public to report anyone matching the description, who showed unusual interest in scouting activities or who traveled frequently to the national forests where the incidents had occurred. For almost a year, these efforts produced no viable suspects. Then, in April 1985, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A forest ranger in Sabine National Forest, conducting an environmental survey, discovered an isolated campsite that showed signs of recent habitation. What caught his attention were 3 Boy Scout merit badges hanging from surrounding trees. The ranger, aware of the ongoing investigation from law enforcement bulletins, immediately reported the discovery without approaching the site further. FBI agents and county sheriff's deputies established surveillance on the campsite, concealing themselves in the surrounding forest. For 3 days, they watched and waited. On the 4th day, a man arrived in a blue Ford pickup truck. He parked approximately a quarter-mile from the campsite and proceeded on foot, carrying a backpack. The surveillance team observed as the man, later identified as Gerald Robert Foreman, age 38, set up camp and then carefully hung additional merit badges from nearby trees. After documenting this behavior, tactical units moved in and apprehended Foreman without incident. A search of Foreman's backpack revealed 15 Boy Scout merit badges, fishing line, a detailed map of the forest with marked locations, and numerous newspaper clippings about the disappearances. The blue Ford pickup was registered in Foreman's name, unlike the stolen vehicles used in previous incidents, but a search of the truck revealed modifications similar to those found in the earlier vehicles, including special locks on storage compartments built into the truck bed. Foreman, a former mechanic who had been working as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant in Longview since 1979, offered no resistance during the arrest. He remained silent as he was transported to the FBI field office in Houston for interrogation. The investigation quickly expanded to include Foreman's residence, a single-family home on a half-acre lot at the edge of Longview. Neighbors described him as quiet and private, but not unfriendly. He had lived there since 1980, kept his property neat, and occasionally volunteered for community cleanup events. None reported any suspicious behavior or visitors. Inside Foreman's home, investigators discovered a room that had been converted into what they described as a shrine to scouting. The walls were covered with Boy Scout memorabilia, vintage posters, framed merit badges, uniforms, and equipment. A bookshelf contained every Boy Scout handbook published since 1960, plus numerous books on wilderness survival, tracking, and outdoor skills. More disturbing were the detailed journals discovered in a locked cabinet. Dating back to 1977, the journals documented Foreman's growing obsession with the Boy Scouts organization, from which he had been dismissed as an assistant scoutmaster in Tyler after parents complained about what they described as his intense focus on certain scouts. The journals detailed Foreman's feelings of rejection and his growing resentment, which eventually transformed into detailed fantasies about testing scouts to see if they were worthy of their badges. The most recent journals contained explicit descriptions of the 3 known abductions and suggested there had been 2 earlier incidents in 1981 and 1982 that had never been connected to the pattern. Investigators also discovered hundreds of photographs of Boy Scout troops taken at public events, campgrounds, and parades. Some photos showed scouts who had been circled in red ink, including the 3 known victims. Perhaps most significant to the investigation was the discovery of a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards in Foreman's garage. This space contained items that would later be identified as belonging to all 3 known victims, plus 2 others whose disappearances had not previously been connected to the case. Confronted with this evidence during interrogation, Foreman eventually began to speak. Over a period of 3 days, he provided details about 5 abductions spanning from 1981 to 1984. He described his methodology, how he would observe scout troops during their campouts, sometimes for days, before selecting a victim, how he would wait until the camp was asleep before entering a tent and coercing the chosen scout to leave quietly by threatening harm to the others. Foreman explained the significance of the suspended badges. Each represented a skill he believed the victim had claimed but not truly mastered. The first badge was always the one he considered most fraudulently earned. The placement of subsequent badges created a path that represented the journey of atonement he forced each victim to undertake. Based on Foreman's statements and evidence collected from his home, investigators were able to locate the remains of the 3rd victim and the previously unknown 4th victim. The 5th victim's remains were never recovered, despite Foreman's directions to a location in Angelina National Forest. The evidence against Gerald Robert Foreman was overwhelming. He was charged with 5 counts of kidnapping and 4 counts of murder. The prosecutor for Smith County, where the case was tried due to pre-trial publicity concerns in the counties where the crimes had occurred, announced that the state would seek the death penalty. The trial began in September 1986. Over 3 weeks, prosecutors presented physical evidence, journal entries, and expert testimony connecting Foreman to each of the 5 abductions and 4 confirmed murders. Behavioral analysts from the FBI testified about the pattern of ritual and escalation documented in his journals. Forensic experts presented DNA evidence, still a relatively new technique in criminal trials, linking items in Foreman's possession to the victims. Foreman's defense team attempted to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, presenting testimony from psychiatrists who diagnosed him with various personality disorders and delusional beliefs. The prosecution countered with experts who testified that regardless of any mental health conditions, Foreman was aware of the nature and wrongfulness of his actions as evidenced by his efforts to conceal evidence and evade capture. On October 17, 1986, after deliberating for just 7 hours, the jury found Gerald Robert Foreman guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase of the trial took an additional week, during which victims' family members provided impact statements describing the devastating effects of their losses. On October 24, 1986, the jury recommended the death penalty, which the judge formally imposed on November 5, 1986. Foreman was transferred to death row at the Ellis Unit of the Texas Department of Corrections, as it was then known, near Huntsville. The appeals process began immediately, with Foreman's attorneys citing various procedural issues and challenging the admissibility of certain evidence. These appeals worked their way through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and eventually to the federal level, but all were ultimately rejected. On June 12, 1997, almost 11 years after his conviction, Gerald Robert Foreman was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He made no final statement. In the aftermath of the case, the Boy Scouts of America implemented additional safety protocols for all camping activities, including the buddy system that required scouts to always remain in pairs, additional adult supervision requirements, and more rigorous screening of volunteer leaders. The FBI incorporated the case into its training materials for the Behavioral Analysis Unit, using it as an example of ritual behavior and signature aspects distinct from modus operandi. The case has been cited in numerous textbooks on criminal psychology and the development of geographical profiling techniques. For the communities of East Texas, the resolution of the case brought closure, but also lasting changes in attitudes toward children's safety and supervision. Parents who had grown up with the freedom to explore the region's forests and lakes now kept closer watch on their own children, aware of how a single individual had shattered the innocence of an entire region. The investigators who worked the case went on to distinguished careers. Several cited the methodical, multi-jurisdictional approach that ultimately solved the case as a model for future investigations. The FBI agents involved helped develop standardized protocols for evidence collection and information sharing across jurisdictional boundaries. For the families of the victims, no resolution could ever be complete. They formed a support group that eventually evolved into a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting child safety and supporting families of missing children. The organization continues to operate today, having assisted hundreds of families through their darkest moments. The case of Gerald Robert Foreman, sometimes referred to in criminology literature as the badge collector case, stands as a testament to the evolution of investigative techniques in the 1980s. It marks a transition point between older, more localized approaches to criminal investigation and the interconnected, database-driven methods that would become standard by the end of the 20th century. The national forests of East Texas eventually returned to their role as places of recreation and natural beauty. Scout troops eventually resumed their activities there, though never again with the same sense of carefree security that had characterized the pre-1983 era. In 1998, on the 15th anniversary of the first disappearance, a memorial was dedicated at the Sam Houston National Forest Visitor Center. A simple stone marker bears the names of the 5 victims and a quote from the Scout Law: "A scout is brave." Below these words is an inscription that has become something of a mantra for both law enforcement and youth protection advocates. Vigilance is the price of safety. The forests still stand, pine needles still cushion the paths, and merit badges are still earned by young scouts. But in the visitor centers and ranger stations across East Texas, alongside maps and wildlife guides, one can find safety brochures and protocols, silent reminders of a time when badges hung from trees led not to achievement, but to unspeakable loss. The case reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand and exploit our trust, who use our symbols of achievement and growth as tools of manipulation. It teaches us that safety emerges not just from awareness of danger, but from the strength of communities united in protection of their most vulnerable members. Perhaps the most important legacy of this dark chapter in East Texas history is not the fear it instilled, but the resolve it fostered, a commitment to ensure that the journey from childhood to adulthood, while never without risk, should never again be interrupted by those who would twist symbols of growth into tokens of terror. In the silence of the pine forests, where sunlight filters through branches and dapples the forest floor, there remains an echo of what was lost. But there also remains the steady presence of those who stand watch, parents, leaders, rangers, and officers, ensuring that the badges earned by young scouts remain symbols of achievement rather than markers of tragedy. The story of the Scout Badge Killer, as it came to be known in media accounts, serves as both warning and affirmation. A warning of the darkness that can hide behind familiar facades, and an affirmation that through vigilance, cooperation, and unwavering commitment to justice, even the most methodical predators will eventually be brought to account. And in the end, that is perhaps the only truly satisfying conclusion to such a tale. Not that evil never exists, for it surely does, but that it does not ultimately triumph. That through the combined efforts of dedicated professionals and concerned communities, the pattern of darkness is finally broken, and the forest paths are reclaimed for the innocent exploration they were meant to foster. The badges that once hung as grim markers now rest in evidence archives, their purpose twisted but their meaning ultimately reclaimed by the justice that closed the case and by the resilience of an organization that refused to be defined by the actions of one disturbed individual who had once moved within its ranks. For the families who lost sons to Foreman's twisted obsession, no measure of justice could ever be sufficient. Yet in the years since the case concluded, many have found purpose in their pain, transforming personal tragedy into public advocacy. Their efforts have helped shape legislation, organizational policies, and public awareness campaigns that continue to protect children decades after their own losses. In the forests of East Texas, Scout troops once again camp beneath the stars, though now with additional safeguards and awareness. The campfires still burn, stories are still told, and badges are still earned through demonstration of real skills and knowledge. The shadows beyond the firelight may seem deeper than they once did, but they no longer conceal the particular threat that haunted these woods for those few terrible years. This is how healing occurs after such wounds, not through forgetting but through remembering in ways that honor what was lost while refusing to surrender what remains. The forests are not abandoned, they are more carefully tended. The organization is not diminished, it is more rigorously protective. The community is not paralyzed, it is more intentionally vigilant. Time passes, trees grow. New generations of scouts earn their badges without knowledge of what transpired in these same forests decades earlier. This too is part of healing. The gradual transition of acute tragedy into historical memory, no less real but no longer raw, a chapter in a longer story rather than the story's end. For those who worked the case, the rangers, deputies, agents, and prosecutors, the resolution brought professional satisfaction, but also lasting effects. Many spoke in subsequent years of how the case changed their approach to their work and even their personal lives, making them more attuned to patterns and more protective of children in their communities. As the 20th century drew to a close and the digital age transformed how information is shared and analyzed, the methodologies developed during the Foreman investigation found new applications. The case, with its emphasis on pattern recognition and cross-jurisdictional cooperation, became part of the foundation upon which modern approaches to serial predator identification and apprehension were built. In criminology classrooms and FBI training facilities, the case continues to be studied not only for its procedural aspects but for the psychological insights it provides. Foreman's journals, with their detailed documentation of fantasies and grievances, long before they manifested in action, offer a rare window into the evolution of a particular type of predator. Valuable knowledge for those tasked with identifying such individuals before fantasy becomes reality. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case lies not in procedural changes or psychological insights, but in a more fundamental shift in perspective. The Foreman case, like other high-profile cases of the 1980s, contributed to a cultural reassessment of assumptions about safety, particularly regarding children. The era's transition from relatively unsupervised childhood to more closely monitored youth experiences can be traced in part to cases like this one, which demonstrated how vulnerable children could be, even in seemingly secure contexts. The balance between protecting children and allowing them the freedom to explore and grow independently remains a complex cultural conversation, one that each generation navigates anew. The Scout Badge Killer case serves as a reference point in that ongoing dialogue, a reminder of what can happen when protection fails, but also of how resilience and adaptation can emerge from tragedy. In the end, the case of Gerald Robert Foreman represents not just the dark chapter it undoubtedly was, but also the response to that darkness, the mobilization of resources, the cooperation across boundaries, the refusal to accept defeat, and ultimately, the restoration of safety, however fragile and contingent that safety might be. The badges no longer hang from trees in East Texas forests. They rest where they belong, on the uniforms of scouts who have legitimately earned them, symbols not of a twisted personal ritual, but of genuine achievement and growth. This is the final victory, the reclamation of symbols, spaces, and institutions from those who would corrupt them. And in that reclamation lies hope. Not the naive hope that danger can be eliminated entirely, but the more resilient hope that through vigilance, cooperation, and unwavering commitment to protecting the vulnerable, communities can face darkness without being defined by it. That forests can still be places of discovery rather than dread. That young people can still journey toward adulthood along paths that, while never without risk, are guarded by those who understand both the value of independence and the necessity of protection. This is the legacy of the Scout Badge Killer case, not just a somber chapter in criminal history, but a testament to how communities respond to and recover from such chapters. Not just a story of predation, but a story of protection. Not just a chronicle of loss, but an affirmation of what remains worth protecting, worth preserving, worth passing on to generations who will explore these same forests under different stars. And in that balanced remembering lies wisdom, the understanding that acknowledging darkness does not require surrendering to it. That vigilance is not the same as fear. That protection is not the opposite of freedom, but its prerequisite. The silence in the East Texas pine forests now is simply the natural silence of wild places, a silence occasionally broken by the voices of scouts learning, growing, achieving under the watchful eyes of leaders trained to balance protection with independence. The badges they earn are untainted by any memory of a time when similar emblems hung from trees for more sinister purposes. This too is justice of a kind, the justice of restoration, of reclamation, of refusing to allow evil to define spaces or symbols beyond its brief, terrible moment. It is perhaps the most profound response to such cases. Not just punishment of the guilty, but preservation of what they sought to corrupt. And so the story ends as it must, not with forgetfulness but with transformation. Not with the elimination of all risk, which is neither possible nor desirable, but with the creation of structures and systems that manage risk while preserving the essential experiences of growth, challenge, and achievement that organizations like the Boy Scouts were created to provide. The Texas forests still stand. Scouts still earn their badges. Campfires still burn in clearings beneath starry skies. This continuation, this persistence, this refusal to abandon either the physical spaces or the formative experiences that were temporarily shadowed by one man's disturbed obsession, this is the final chapter of the story. Not an ending that erases what came before, but one that places it in a larger context of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring human commitment to nurturing each new generation despite the risks such nurturing inevitably entails. In that commitment, renewed with each scout who receives a badge, with each campfire circle formed beneath the Texas stars, with each skill learned and challenge met, lies the true answer to those who would twist such symbols and experiences to darker purposes. Not denial, but affirmation. Not retreat, but reclamation. Not surrender, but a quiet, determined insistence that what matters most will be preserved, protected, and passed on, despite all that threatens it. And in the end, that insistence, manifested in changed policies, increased vigilance, and renewed commitment to both protection and growth, stands as the most fitting memorial to those lost. Not just markers of stone or words of remembrance, but living systems that better protect today's children, because of what was learned at such terrible cost decades ago. The silence in the forests now is not the silence of absence or abandonment, but the silence of peaceful purpose, the quiet concentration of young people learning skills, testing limits, growing into themselves beneath the watchful eyes of those who understand both the value and the vulnerability of childhood. This transformation of silence from ominous to purposeful marks the true conclusion of the case. Not merely the execution of a murderer, but the reconsecration of spaces and symbols he sought to corrupt. And in that reconsecration lies hope for all communities touched by similar darkness. The hope that what is valuable can be reclaimed, what is meaningful can be preserved, and what is most precious can be protected without being suffocated by that very protection. This delicate balance, achieved through thoughtful adaptation rather than fearful reaction, represents perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the Scout Badge Killer case, a legacy that continues to shape how East Texas and communities far beyond think about the protection of children and the preservation of formative experiences despite the risks they inevitably entail. The badges still hang on Scouts' uniforms, no longer on trees. The forests still welcome young explorers, now more carefully watched over. The silence still speaks, but what it says has changed from warning to welcome. This transformation, subtle but profound, is the true ending of the story, an ending that acknowledges darkness without surrendering to it, that remembers loss without being defined by it, and that honors what was taken by preserving what remains. What remained untold in the official record of the case, the subtle patterns and psychological undercurrents that extended beyond the courtroom testimony and forensic evidence, revealed themselves slowly over the years following Foreman's execution. The fuller picture emerged through interviews with investigators, journal articles by forensic psychologists, and academic studies conducted a decade after the case closed. Throughout 1980 and early 1981, Gerald Foreman had methodically documented his observations of Scout troops across East Texas. His journals from this period, analyzed by FBI behavioral specialists, showed what they described as an incubation phase of his pathology. He attended public Scout events, photographed camping areas from a distance, and collected Scout publications, all while constructing an elaborate internal narrative about what he perceived as the degradation of standards within the organization that had rejected him. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, name altered, a forensic psychologist who conducted a posthumous case study published in the Journal of Investigative Psychology in 1998, observed that Foreman's journals revealed a man who had created an alternative identity as an evaluator or judge of scouting standards. This identity, according to Matthews, allowed him to transform his rejection by the organization into a position of imagined authority over it. The suspended badges were not merely signatures or trophies, Matthews wrote, but representations of a perverse evaluation system. Each badge placement created what Foreman called in his writings a path of judgment that mirrored legitimate Scout advancement trails but inverted their purpose. The precise trigger for Foreman's transition from fantasy to action remained speculative, but journal entries from December 1980 referred repeatedly to a regional Scout jamboree he had observed from a distance. He described watching as merit badges were awarded in a public ceremony, writing, "They hand them out like candy now, no real tests, no real skills. Someone needs to verify what they claim to know." Investigators noted that Foreman's first documented abduction occurred 3 months after this entry. The earliest known victim, identified only after Foreman's arrest, was a Scout from a troop in Nacogdoches who disappeared during a weekend camping trip in March 1981. His remains were among those found beneath Foreman's garage floor. The badges taken from this victim, fishing, camping, and pioneering, were the first Foreman would hang in the forest, beginning a pattern that he would refine over subsequent abductions. Sheriff's Deputy James Walters, name altered, who served on the original task force and later became Sheriff of San Augustine County, reflected on the case in a 1995 interview with a regional law enforcement journal. "What struck me then, and what I still think about now," Walters said, "is how much Foreman's patterns were hiding in plain sight. Those badges weren't random. They were specific to each victim, specifically the ones they'd earned most recently. He studied these kids, knew which badges they had, which ones they were proud of. This level of observation and planning pointed to what FBI analysts later identified as a particularly dangerous form of stalking behavior, one focused not on a specific individual, but on a category of victims defined by their participation in a specific activity or organization. This insight would later inform training protocols for recognizing potential threats to youth groups and other defined populations. The vehicles Foreman used in his crimes revealed another layer of his methodical approach. Forensic examination of the GMC Vandura and other vehicles recovered during the investigation showed that the modifications, additional locks, reinforced partitions, and custom storage areas, had been implemented with professional-grade tools and considerable skill, consistent with Foreman's mechanical background. What investigators found most disturbing was evidence that these modifications had been made after the vehicles were stolen, but before they were used in abductions, indicating a cooling-off period during which Foreman prepared his tools with deliberation rather than impulse. This pattern suggested a level of planning and restraint that contradicted common assumptions about impulsive, violent offenders. In a secure evidence storage facility maintained by the FBI in Houston, the collection of merit badges recovered from Foreman's possession remains preserved, 73 in total, of which 56 were positively identified as belonging to known or suspected victims. The remaining 17, never connected to specific cases, prompted speculation that Foreman may have been responsible for additional disappearances that were never linked to him. The badge selection itself revealed a pattern that prosecutors did not emphasize during the trial, but that behavioral analysts later identified as significant. The most common badges found in Foreman's collection were those related to outdoor skills and self-sufficiency. Wilderness survival appeared most frequently, followed by orienteering, emergency preparedness, and first aid. These were precisely the skills that might have helped victims escape or survive their abductions. Dr. Matthews theorized that this selection reflected Foreman's twisted logic. He appears to have been particularly fixated on badges that represented survival skills, precisely the abilities his victims would need to escape his tests, but would ultimately find inadequate against an adult predator who had orchestrated every aspect of the scenario. The geographical pattern of Foreman's activities, mapped by the FBI's nascent geographical profiling unit, revealed a methodical expansion outward from his home base in Longview. The first incidents occurred within a 50-mile radius of his residence, with subsequent abductions taking place at gradually increasing distances, a pattern that analysts noted was contrary to the more common criminal behavior of establishing a comfort zone and operating primarily within it. This expanding geographical range corresponded with increasingly elaborate, preparatory behaviors documented in Foreman's journals. Earlier incidents involved minimal planning and opportunistic victim selection, while later abductions were preceded by extensive surveillance, sometimes lasting weeks. This escalation pattern would later be incorporated into FBI training materials as an example of how predatory behavior can evolve and expand in the absence of intervention. The badges themselves, as physical evidence, provided investigators with crucial forensic information that was only partially utilized during the original investigation due to the limited techniques available in the mid-1980s. When the evidence was re-examined in the early 1990s using more advanced methods, investigators discovered that the fishing line used to suspend the badges contained microscopic skin cells. DNA analysis, though primitive by later standards, confirmed these were Foreman's, placing him directly at the scene of the badge placements. More subtly, the manner in which the badges were hung, consistently at 7 feet above ground, attached with a specific type of knot, and oriented to face south, revealed what forensic psychologists described as a ritual signature that went beyond mere practical considerations. These consistent elements suggested that the placement itself held symbolic significance for Foreman, rather than serving merely as a taunt to pursuers. Sheriff Walters, in his 1995 interview, recalled a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but later took on new meaning. When we arrested Foreman at that campsite, he had a compass out. At first we thought he was just navigating, but later realized he was checking the directional orientation of those badges. They all had to face south. Don't know why, but it mattered to him that they were precise. This precision extended to Foreman's selection of campsites to target. Analysis of scout troop locations plotted against Foreman's known movements revealed that he bypassed numerous troops and camping areas that would have presented easier opportunities in favor of those that matched specific criteria: proximity to water, distance from ranger stations, and perhaps most significantly, troops that were working on specific merit badges during their outings. How Foreman obtained this information remained unclear until investigators discovered subscription records showing he received multiple regional scout newsletters under different names. These publications routinely announced upcoming camping trips and often mentioned which merit badges would be the focus of specific outings. This intelligence-gathering method allowed him to target troops precisely when they would be working on the badges he considered most significant for his tests. The communities affected by Foreman's crimes developed coping mechanisms that extended beyond the immediate safety measures implemented after the first discovered abductions. School counselors across East Texas reported a phenomenon they called forest anxiety among children, a specific fear not just of strangers, but of wooded areas that had previously been places of recreation and exploration. Dr. Michael Thornton, name altered, who served as a consulting psychologist for several school districts in the region, noted in a 1987 paper that this anxiety manifested differently than typical stranger danger responses. These children weren't just afraid of unknown adults, he wrote. They developed specific environmental anxieties, fears of trails leading away from campsites, of trees with objects hanging from them, of vehicles parked on forest roads. Their mental geography had been fundamentally altered. This alteration of community psychology extended to adults as well. Rangers at Sam Houston National Forest reported a significant decline in family camping that persisted for years after Foreman's arrest. When families did return to the forests, rangers noted behavioral changes. Parents keeping children in constant visual range, campsites set up with tents grouped more tightly together, and increased reporting of any unusual objects or people observed in the vicinity. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department responded to these changes by implementing what they called secure campsite design principles in state parks across the region, modifications to camping areas that increased visibility, reduced isolated tent sites, and positioned ranger stations to provide better oversight of areas primarily used by youth groups. These environmental modifications, combined with procedural changes within scouting organizations, created layers of protection that addressed not just the specific threat Foreman had posed, but the vulnerability he had exposed. The Boy Scouts' two-deep leadership policy, requiring at least 2 adult leaders to be present at all activities, became more strictly enforced. The organization also implemented check-in, check-out procedures for campsites and designated secure sleep protocols that included periodic monitoring throughout the night. For the law enforcement community, the case provided painful but valuable lessons about jurisdictional cooperation and information sharing. The task force model developed during the Foreman investigation became a template for subsequent multi-agency responses to crimes that crossed county and departmental boundaries. FBI Special Agent Karen Martinez, name altered, who joined the investigation after the third known disappearance and later specialized in crimes against children, observed in a 1996 training document that the jurisdictional fragmentation that initially hampered the investigation reflected a common vulnerability in rural law enforcement. The same isolation that makes these areas attractive to certain types of predators also complicates the coordination required to identify pattern crimes. The solution developed by the task force, a centralized evidence database accessible to all participating agencies, presaged the more sophisticated information-sharing systems that would become standard by the late 1990s. The case became a reference point in arguments for the development of Amber Alert systems and other rapid response protocols for child abductions. For forensic psychology, the Foreman case provided a rare opportunity to study the development of predatory behavior through documentary evidence. His journals, spanning from 1977 to his arrest in 1985, offered what Dr. Matthews described as a longitudinal record of pathology escalation that helped researchers understand how fantasy evolves into action. Particularly significant was the evidence of what psychologists termed boundary testing, incidents documented in Foreman's journals where he progressively violated smaller taboos before committing to more serious crimes. He described watching scout troops from concealed positions, then moved to briefly entering camps at night without taking action, then to entering tents while scouts slept, all before his first actual abduction. This pattern of incremental boundary violation has since become a recognized warning sign in threat assessment protocols used by organizations that work with vulnerable populations. Training materials now routinely include guidance on recognizing and responding to these precursor behaviors before they escalate to harm. The families of Foreman's victims responded to their losses in varied ways, but several found common purpose in advocacy for child safety reforms. Martha Ellison, name altered, whose son was Foreman's second known victim, became particularly influential in this movement. Initially focused on changes within scouting organizations, her advocacy eventually expanded to address broader issues of child safety in institutional settings. In testimony before a Texas Senate committee in 1988, Ellison articulated what would become a guiding principle for subsequent legislation. No system that relies entirely on catching predators after they act will ever be adequate. We need structures that prevent harm before it occurs, that make vulnerable populations harder targets, and that ensure no one person ever has unsupervised access to children. This principle informed the Texas Youth Safety Act of 1989, which established minimum background check requirements for employees and volunteers in youth-serving organizations and created mandatory reporting protocols for suspected child abuse or exploitation. Similar legislation would be adopted in other states throughout the 1990s, often citing the Foreman case as evidence of the need for systemic rather than reactive approaches to child protection. For the scouting organization itself, the case represented both a failure and an opportunity for transformation. Internal documents released years later revealed that regional leadership had been aware of complaints about Foreman's behavior as an assistant scoutmaster years before his crimes escalated to abduction and murder. His dismissal from the organization had not been accompanied by any formal documentation of the reasons or any notification to other troops or youth organizations. This revelation prompted what Scout leadership described as a fundamental reassessment of how the organization handled concerns about adult volunteers. The resulting Youth Protection Program, formally adopted in 1990, established clear reporting requirements, prohibited one-on-one adult-youth interactions, and created a confidential file system to track individuals removed from leadership positions for cause. These changes, while emerging from tragedy, have been credited with preventing countless potential incidents in the decades since. Similar protocols have been adopted by other youth organizations nationwide, creating what child safety experts describe as protective redundancy, overlapping systems designed to compensate for the potential failure of any single safeguard. The psychological dimension of the case extended to questions about how Foreman selected specific victims from among the many scouts he observed. FBI analysts who studied his journals and post-arrest statements noted that he appeared to focus on boys who had recently received multiple merit badges in a short time frame, what he interpreted as evidence of standards being lowered. This selection criterion reflected Foreman's distorted belief system about testing and evaluation, but it also revealed a more general predatory pattern, the identification of distinctions or characteristics meaningful only to the predator, but used to rationalize victim selection. This insight helped develop training for youth organization leaders in recognizing when adult interest in specific children might indicate concerning patterns rather than appropriate mentorship. The memorial established in 1998 at the Sam Houston National Forest Visitor Center serves multiple purposes beyond commemoration. Forest Service personnel incorporated it into their educational programs, using the site to teach visitors about both historical awareness and contemporary safety practices. Ranger presentations acknowledge the events without sensationalizing them, emphasizing how changes implemented afterward have made the forests safer for all visitors. This approach reflects what trauma specialists recognize as informed resilience, the ability to acknowledge past harm while demonstrating the systems and practices developed in response. For new generations of scouts camping in East Texas forests, the legacy of the case is not primarily the fear it once generated, but the protective structures it helped create. Dr. Thornton, in a follow-up study conducted in 2000, observed that children in the region no longer exhibited the specific forest anxiety that had been common in the late 1980s. Instead, they demonstrated what he described as informed confidence, an awareness of potential risks balanced with knowledge of protective measures and appropriate responses. The most healthy outcome, he wrote, is not the absence of awareness, but the integration of awareness into a broader context of confidence and competence. These children know the forests have not always been safe, but they also know how they are kept safe now, and that knowledge enables rather than inhibits their exploration. This balance between awareness and confidence extends to the training of new law enforcement officers in the region. The case is included in academy curricula, not primarily as a cautionary tale, but as an example of effective multi-jurisdictional response and the importance of pattern recognition in rural crime investigation. Sheriff Walters, who continued to speak about the case to new officer classes until his retirement in 2002, emphasized this perspective. We don't teach this case to scare new deputies or to glorify the investigation. We teach it because it shows how paying attention to small details, a badge hanging from a tree branch, a specific knot, a tire tread pattern, can reveal connections that save lives. These are the skills that matter when you're working across county lines with limited resources. For forensic science, the case represented an early application of techniques that would later become standard. The collection and preservation of DNA evidence, though rudimentary by current standards, helped establish protocols that influenced subsequent investigations. The casting of tire impressions, the analysis of knot structures, and the preservation of trace evidence all reflected emerging best practices that the case helped refine. The criminological study of ritual aspects in serial offenses gained valuable insights from the Foreman case. The specific placement of badges, the consistent geographical patterns, and the documentation of fantasy preceding action provided what criminologists termed signature analysis opportunities, distinguishing between aspects of criminal behavior that serve practical purposes and those that fulfill psychological needs. This distinction became increasingly important in subsequent investigations, helping law enforcement differentiate between copycat crimes and those committed by the same perpetrator. The Foreman case demonstrated how signature elements, the specific height of suspended badges, their directional orientation, the specific knots used, could be more reliable identifying factors than more general modus operandi elements that might be adopted by others. The broader social impact of the case extended beyond specific policy changes to influence how communities across Texas and beyond thought about the balance between children's independence and their protection. The pendulum swing toward greater supervision that characterized the late 1980s and early 1990s can be traced in part to high-profile cases like Foreman's, which demonstrated the vulnerability of children even in structured activities and supervised settings. As this pendulum has gradually sought a new equilibrium in recent decades, the lessons of the case have been integrated into more nuanced approaches to child safety, ones that aim to build resilience and awareness without unnecessary restriction. Modern youth protection approaches emphasize skills and knowledge alongside rules and supervision, teaching children to recognize concerning situations while still encouraging appropriate independence. The badge, that simple emblem of achievement at the center of the case, has itself undergone re-evaluation within scouting organizations. While still central to the advancement system, the emphasis has shifted somewhat from the physical token to the demonstrable skills it represents. Leadership training now includes specific guidance on ensuring badges reflect genuine competency rather than mere participation, addressing in a healthy way the very concern that Foreman had distorted into his criminal pathology. In 2007, on the 20th anniversary of Foreman's conviction, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit published a retrospective analysis of the case as part of their professional development series. The document noted that many investigative techniques that had been innovative or exceptional in the Foreman case had since become standard practice. The use of geographical profiling, timeline analysis, signature assessment, and victimology studies were now routinely applied to similar cases. What made the case continue to stand out, even decades later, was the unusually complete documentation of the offender's psychological evolution through his journals. Few cases in criminal history provide such detailed insight into the progression from fantasy to action, making the Foreman materials particularly valuable for research and training despite the passage of time. For the East Texas communities most directly affected, the case gradually transitioned from immediate trauma to historical memory. Local historical societies include the events in their chronicles of the region, but increasingly as one chapter in a longer narrative rather than a defining moment. This transition reflects the natural healing process of communities, not forgetting, but contextualizing, not diminishing the significance of what occurred, but refusing to be permanently defined by it. The forest paths still wind through pine woods. Merit badges are still earned and awarded. Children still explore under watchful but not smothering supervision. This continuation, this refusal to abandon either physical spaces or formative experiences, stands as perhaps the most meaningful response to those who would corrupt them. In this persistence lies a kind of answer to the darkness the case represented. Not that such darkness doesn't exist or won't recur in different forms, but that communities can respond with systems of protection that preserve rather than abandon what matters most. Not with fearful retreat, but with thoughtful adaptation. Not with paralysis, but with renewed commitment to the experiences that foster growth and resilience, even as they acknowledge the reality of risk. The badges no longer hang from trees in East Texas forests as grim markers of a predator's path. They rest where they belong, on the uniforms of scouts who have earned them through genuine effort and demonstrated skill, supervised by leaders trained to nurture and protect in appropriate balance in communities that have learned that vigilance need not preclude adventure. In the end, this may be the most fitting memorial to those lost, not just remembrance, but reclamation, not just safety measures, but the preservation of experiences worth protecting. Not just the conviction of a predator, but the conviction that what he sought to corrupt remains valuable, vital, and worth defending for each new generation that follows forest paths beneath the Texas pines. This narrative is based on archives and historical accounts. Some names have been altered. We seek to understand, not sensationalize. The outcome corresponds to public records of conviction. No graphic violence was described.